Returning to our top story today, and that is China's ambassador to Canada saying canola tariffs will be dropped if Canada drops its tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles.
In a week already crowded with trade disputes, an unexpected announcement from Beijing changed the tone of global headlines. China's ambassador to Canada said that his government would lift all canola tariffs if Canada agreed to drop its tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. At first, it sounded like a side story in a crowded news cycle, but within hours, markets and political circles in both Ottawa and Washington were paying close attention. The reason was simple. This was not only about canola or electric cars. It was about who really controls the rules of the modern trade battlefield. For months, Washington has been tightening pressure on its allies to follow its line against China, demanding that partners like Canada apply the same 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles that the U.S. imposed earlier this year. Canada complied, hoping loyalty would protect its industries from more U.S. tariffs. Instead, it found itself punished twice, by its biggest trading partner and by China. Beijing's move to cut off Canadian canola exports hit farmers across the prairies. For them, the issue was not geopolitical, it was survival. And now, with China's new proposal, Canada faces a difficult question. Should it continue standing with Washington or seize the chance to restore one of its most profitable export markets? The moment carried deeper irony. What was meant to isolate China has ended up isolating the United States. Trump's tariff strategy, once seen as a show of strength, was now producing the very fractures he promised to prevent. When the United States imposed its 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles in late 2024, the goal was clear: block a flood of low-cost, high-quality cars that American automakers could not compete with. Canada joined in, matching the same tariff level after Trump's administration urged Ottawa to stand together against Beijing's EV surge. There was no direct benefit for Canada. The country imports very few Chinese vehicles, and its own auto sector depends heavily on integrated production with U.S. firms. Yet Ottawa followed Washington's lead, believing cooperation would strengthen its position in ongoing negotiations with the U.S. Instead, the strategy backfired. Within weeks, Beijing struck back with tariffs on Canadian canola, 76% on seed, 100% on oil and meal, effectively shutting down a multi-billion-dollar export market. The Canadian Canola Growers Association reported in September 2025 that not a single shipment of canola had entered China since the tariffs were imposed. Prices for prairie farmers fell sharply during harvest season, forcing some to store their crops rather than sell at a loss. Meanwhile, Trump's policy also began to squeeze American consumers. U.S. automakers, shielded from Chinese competition, raised prices as production costs rose. What was supposed to protect the U.S. industry became another source of inflation. The chain reaction exposed the fragility of the entire North American trade structure. Canada's compliance created a new dependency. When the U.S. acts, Canada bears the collateral damage. And now, as China offers a way out for Canada alone, Trump's administration is caught in a dilemma. The move undermines Washington's effort to maintain a united front against Beijing and reveals how limited its leverage has become. For Prime Minister Mark Carney, the timing could not be worse. His government is under pressure from both sides of the economy. On one side, the canola industry is demanding immediate relief. On the other, Ontario's auto sector, supported by Premier Doug Ford, is urging Ottawa to keep the EV tariffs to protect Canadian manufacturing. In an interview last month, Rick White, the head of the Canadian Canola Growers Association, described the situation as unsustainable. Farmers have completed their harvests, but bins across the prairies are full and prices remain low because they have nowhere to sell. The group met with Carney on September 17 to insist that reopening the Chinese market must be a national priority. They were clear, this is not a technical issue, but a political one. Only the federal government can decide whether to trade EV tariffs for agricultural recovery. The numbers speak for themselves. Before the tariffs, China bought roughly 40% of Canada's canola exports, worth more than $3.5 billion a year, according to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Losing that market has left deep scars, especially in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. At the same time, the Ontario Auto Lobby warns that removing the EV tariffs could invite Chinese-made cars into the market, threatening local assembly plants tied to Detroit-based automakers. The standoff between these two regions reflects Canada's larger reality. It is a country pulled between the economic power of its southern neighbor and the trade opportunities across the Pacific. This tension, however, is not entirely Canada's doing. It is the direct result of Washington's tariff web. The more Trump uses tariffs as weapons, the more his allies are forced to make impossible choices between loyalty and self-interest.
China's latest offer is not a coincidence. It is a calculated signal that Beijing understands how to exploit divisions within North America. By appealing directly to Canada's economic pain points, China is testing how far Ottawa is willing to distance itself from Washington's line. If Canada accepts the deal, it could reopen a vital agricultural market and score a political win for Carney at home. But it would also send a message that the U.S. no longer dictates every trade move north of the border. For Trump's administration, that would be a serious symbolic loss. What makes this moment striking is how completely the roles have reversed. 2 years ago, the U.S. was the center of global trade influence. Today, it is watching its closest ally negotiate economic terms with the very country it sought to isolate. This is what a policy backfire looks like. A strategy designed to build control ends up eroding it. For farmers in the prairies, the hope is simple: get canola moving again. For automakers in Ontario, it is survival. But for Washington, the lesson is much larger. The more the U.S. treats its partners as junior players, the more those partners will seek balance elsewhere. The story of canola and electric vehicles may seem small in the vast landscape of trade disputes, yet it captures a turning point. Trump's approach to global commerce, built on threats and loyalty tests, has created openings for rivals to turn U.S. strength into vulnerability. China's proposition to Canada is not generosity, it is strategy. It transforms a simple agricultural issue into a geopolitical test of trust. Whether Ottawa takes the offer or not, the signal is already clear. America's tariff-first diplomacy has reached its limits. What began as a campaign to make America stronger has instead pushed its allies to find independence and even to listen when its rivals come knocking. That is how a trade war meant to isolate China ended up isolating Washington itself.
And earlier this week, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a new economic and security agreement with Mexico. And just yesterday, Canada's finance minister held talks in Denmark with European Union officials. Now, all of this comes as Canada looks to diversify its trade portfolio in the face of Trump's tariffs.
When Washington raised tariffs this year, Canada faced a stark choice: stay quiet and accept the pressure, or reach out to new partners. Ottawa chose the second path. Within days, Prime Minister Mark Carney signed a new economic and security agreement with Mexico, and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne traveled to Europe for high-level talks with the European Union. These steps were not symbolic gestures. They were clear signals that Canada will not stand alone no matter how much pressure comes from the White House. What was supposed to be a moment of weakness has turned into a moment of action. Trump's tariff strategy was designed to corner Canada, to make the country feel dependent on access to the U.S. market. Instead, it has become the trigger for Canada to strengthen bonds with its continental neighbor and one of the world's largest economic blocs. The choice Ottawa made is now reshaping Canada's trade strategy and shifting the balance of power across North America and beyond. Trump's reciprocal tariff regime was unveiled this summer as a sweeping attempt to reset global trade. According to the White House proclamations, tariffs on cars and parts rose to 25% in March 2025 under Section 232, and a wider reciprocal framework took effect on September 1. The intention was clear. By raising duties, the administration hoped partners like Canada would concede quickly. Yet the opposite is unfolding. Ottawa is responding not with retreat, but with acceleration. Instead of waiting for relief from Washington, Canada is building a trade firewall of its own. Tariffs that were designed to weaken Canadian industries are forcing Ottawa to search for stability elsewhere. Each new duty on steel or aluminum, each added barrier on canola or copper is acting as a trigger for diversification. Rather than standing isolated, Canada is turning outward, binding itself more closely with neighbors and allies who are eager for dependable partners. This is how a tariff policy meant to dominate has ended up opening doors for Canada abroad. The first door opened in Mexico City. In mid-September, Carney and President Claudia Sheinbaum announced a strategic partnership covering agriculture, infrastructure, energy, and security. For Canadian canola farmers cut off from China's $5 billion market, Mexico's growing biofuel sector now offers a badly needed outlet. For Canada's energy producers, Mexico's infrastructure expansion creates fresh demand. The agreement is short on fanfare but long on significance. It showed that Canada can still shape continental ties without bending to Washington. Only days later, Champagne landed in Europe to pursue the next step. Speaking with EU officials in Denmark, the message was about more than trade volumes. Canada already has CETA, which in its 8 years has lifted services trade by over 70% and goods trade by 65%. The new focus is what experts call CETA Plus. That means moving into strategic cooperation on energy security, critical minerals, defense, artificial intelligence, and digital trade. These are the very sectors where Canada wants to secure future growth. With Europe searching for reliable suppliers of nickel, cobalt, and clean energy inputs, Ottawa is presenting itself as a trusted partner. By expanding ties with both Mexico and the EU, Canada is weaving a network that makes tariffs from Washington less decisive.
The chain of events is striking. Trump applied tariffs to isolate Canada. Instead, Canada responded by strengthening bonds with Mexico in Europe. The U.S. sought leverage. What it created was momentum for Ottawa to diversify. Rather than waiting for concessions, Canada is building its own strategy. The numbers tell the story. Trade with the EU has already expanded by double digits under CETA. The new partnership with Mexico targets agriculture and energy worth billions. And consultations at home are preparing Canada for the formal review of the North American Trading Pact next year. The lesson is that tariffs do not always weaken their target. In this case, they have produced resilience. Canada is not retreating, but repositioning. Trump's policy was meant to break Canada's unity, yet it has instead accelerated Canada's outreach and strengthened its global standing. What was supposed to be a trap has become a turning point. Canada is showing that it can withstand pressure, forge new ties, and emerge more secure than before.
Looking around the world now, you've got China sort of playing by its own playbook economically. You have the U.S. playing by its own playbook, ignoring various agreements, including at times USMCA. What does that mean for the rules-based system for a middle power like Canada?
At the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a message that left many in Washington unsettled.
And nobody's perfect in this. We have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And we're re-engaging with China and other major economies in terms of developing the rules bilaterally with them.
He announced that Canada would re-engage with China, seeking to establish a new framework for bilateral rules. This declaration landed just as the United States, under President Trump, has extended its reciprocal tariff regime to every major trading partner, including Canada. The tariffs were meant to force others into accepting America's terms. Yet Carney signaled that Canada was ready to chart its own path. Instead of bowing to pressure, Ottawa is turning outward, searching for new alliances and new leverage. The story begins with a clash of visions. Trump builds walls of tariffs. Carney opens doors to alternative partners. That contrast sets the stage for what comes next.
Carney made clear that both Washington and Beijing are playing by their own rulebooks.
For Canada, that reality means waiting for others to return to multilateral discipline is no longer an option. Ottawa will now attempt to develop direct rules with China, recognizing the risks but also the opportunities of engaging the world's second-largest economy. Sensitive areas such as national security and data privacy will remain closed. Yet Canada intends to carve out a controlled space for trade and cooperation. This is not surrender, but calculation. With Trump escalating confrontation and tariffs disrupting steel, autos, and farm products, Carney has decided that Canada must place a chip on every table. The re-engagement with China is meant to give Ottawa more balance and more say, even if it means moving in a direction opposite to Washington. This step is designed to give Canada breathing room at a time when U.S. trade actions are tightening around all partners. Carney also reminded his audience that Canada already holds positions in two of the world's largest rules-based systems, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as CPTPP, and the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. These agreements include standards for labor and sustainability, the kind of provisions that are recognizable and enforceable. By being part of both, Ottawa can serve as a bridge between Europe and Asia. The United States, by contrast, has stepped away. Trump pulled America out of the original TPP and has repeatedly ignored commitments under USMCA. Carney's point was not hidden. Canada is investing in systems where rules matter, while Washington sidelines itself. As those networks expand, America risks becoming the bystander. Ottawa is signaling that its future will not be locked inside Trump's tariff cage. Instead, Canada is building the kind of international bridges that leave Washington outside the room when new rules are written. Carney did not deny Canada's vulnerability. Nearly 80% of Canadian trade still flows south into the United States. But he emphasized the importance of what he called the growth at the margin. New trade with Europe, with CPTPP countries, and with China can shift the balance over time. Even small increases in those directions can change the outlook for industries battered by tariffs. Trump's reciprocal tariffs, meant to squeeze, are creating the incentive for Canada to move elsewhere. The backfire is clear. Instead of reinforcing dependence, the policy has accelerated diversification. Canada is showing that it can step out of America's shadow and place itself in the center of a different global map. The contrast could not be sharper. Trump designed his tariff regime to keep Canada in line, but Carney's new approach flips that logic. By re-engaging with China and doubling down on Europe and Asia, Ottawa is no longer asking Washington for permission. Canada is signaling that it has options and that the United States is not the only game in town. This is the image that left Trump stunned, watching as his neighbor quietly walked out of the cage he built. That is why Carney's words in New York carried such weight. Trump sought to lock Canada in. Ottawa has walked out, leaving the U.S. president stunned as his northern neighbor rewrites the script of survival and influence.